Okay. Kai, I'm speaking to you from Namp, Melbourne, whose traditional owners are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where it's currently the second longest night of the year. I think the opposite of where many of you are. It's a season of chin-up, the season of cockatoos. Australia has wonderful birds. And I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and to the ancestors of the lands where you come from. Today, now, with your permission, we'll share our learnings over the course of the next hour. Hosted on the Garland platform, the Reinventing the Wheel series is an initiative of the Knowledge House for Craft, an association of thinkers and makers that aims to reflect the global diversity of our field. Each of these talks becomes a spoke in the wheel, a growing repository of craft knowledge. And I wish to acknowledge my colleague in this endeavour who's present, Kamya Sharma, and I think Arti Kolra is also beaming in. In the series so far, we've heard from Arti Kolra on Rabindranath Tagore, Laila Hamad on the Arab focus on smell, Lagi Mama on the customary Moana perspective, Linda McIntosh on royalty in Laotian craft, Joseph Ndioni on One Village, One Product, Ayong Cho on the role of universities in modern Korean craft, Ezra Shales on industrial craft in the US, Patricia Flanagan on haptic interface, Annie Cheng on the development of the Chinese workstation, Sachiko Tomishiga on Japanese mirrorcraft in ancient Kyoto, Liliana Murray and Sylvia Sasaoka on Brazilian Mingue, Sharon Tsang de Lister on refugee craft, and Marty Cross on celluloid as a medium for craft. Now, inspired by the discourse of our Tongan colleagues, we call on the previous speaker to make a salutation before we begin. So in the last talk, Kamya Sharma spoke of the role of the sari in the formation of the modern Indian nation, and I call on Kamya to make the salutation. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone, wherever you're joining from, and greetings to you from Mysore, India. I'm Kamya, and I've been involved with the Garland Conversations for over a year now. Today, I'm offering a salutation from the Tirukkural, which is an ancient Tamil text. Karka kasadara karpavai katrapin nirka adarku taga. It translates to learn that which is worth learning. Once learned, live by what you have learned.
Thank you so much, Kamya. Live by what you have learned. Yes, we'll see how that translates with the makers that we discuss today. So this is the third event we've hosted in partnership with the Journal of Modern Craft. The first was on the craft of mask wearing, a very pandemic related issue, and the second on craft and nationalism with Pelsu Forrest and Xiu Wu from China. Now, the latest issue of Journal of Modern Craft, 14.3, contains several fascinating articles about female modernist textile artists of the 20th century. And so we have three of the contributors to that issue with us, Antonia Behan, Michael Mamp, and Vishal Khandelwal, if I've said it correctly, thank you. And I will introduce them before they speak. They'll speak briefly about their papers, and we'll have a chance then to do a little magic as we see what kind of parallels there are between these three individuals, the two Ethels and the Nelly, who were working in the 20th century. And this is part of the magic of the scholarship that this particular issue of Journal of Modern Craft has. So if we could begin with you, Antonia. Antonia Behan is Assistant Professor of Design History and Material Cultures in a Global World at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. She's written about the relationship between modernism and arts and crafts, particularly in relation to Bauhaus weavers, and especially Ethel Mairet. Her article is something very important to say about the concept of biotechnics that connects science and culture. So over to you, Antonia, if you could explain to us about your very interesting article. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Thank you so much, and hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world. And first, let me extend a sincere thank you to Kevin Murray and Garland Magazine for hosting us today. I'm really thrilled to be part of this truly wonderful platform, and I'm looking forward to discussing modernist textiles with Vishal and Michael's rich articles, and also with the audience today. If you purchase athletic or outdoors gear, you may be familiar with the company Smartwool. They produce activewear and technical gear such as socks and base layers. Rather than using polyester-based fabrics for performance wear, Smartwool leverages the natural antibacterial, wicking, and insulating properties of merino wool fiber as a high-performance technical material. It is high-tech and yet natural. Similarly, the New Zealand company Lanaco finds the technical properties of its Helix filter media in the non-woven electrostatic properties inherent in wool, and uses these materials for a variety of uses, including for medical N95 rated masks and respirators for astronauts at NASA. Again, technology is not coming from a scientific laboratory. Instead, Lanaco supports farmers breeding specialized sheep for specific fiber qualities. These companies exemplify some contemporary sustainability-focused design approaches, which often go by names such as biodesign and biomimicry. In the early 20th centuries, designers and makers likewise looked to nature for design inspiration, to natural materials for technical properties, and to craft as a way of researching these. In my article, Ethel Mairet's Textile Biotechnics and the Aesthetics of Materials, I explore these ideas in the work of Ethel Mairet, a hand weaver and craft revivalist active in the 1930s to 1950s in Britain. But although her engagement with natural dyes, sheep shearing, and hand looms might suggest otherwise, her craft practice was far from anachronistic. And I argue in this article, we might even see it as modernist. While she is better known for her hand-woven textile works, her books and lectures have gone unstudied, perhaps due to the gendered associations with the category of craft and practice. And I show you here, I just really like this contrast of woman writes about Dorset sheep and wool, and the kind of emphasis it has on her writings. In analyzing Mairet's archive, I make the case for reinserting Mairet in prominent discussions of theories of craft and design, including that of the concept of biotechnics. Biotechnics was a concept that allowed Mairet to articulate her project as a modernist, connecting embodied with historical knowledge and tradition with the industrial age. Biotechnics originated in the late 19th century as a particular theory of design, one that held nature as the prime inventor and urged designers to see structures in nature to serve as solutions for design problems in modern materials. And we can see here how the structure of the lily is copied for a structure in architecture. In the work of Sir Patrick Geddes, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and Louis Mumford, as well as Frederick Kiesler, biotechnics signified advanced research into the interrelation between biology and design, and focused on the relationship between humans and their technological and natural environments. Mairet did not simply adopt these theories, but extended them in concrete ways, informed by her practice with materials. Mairet was likewise interested in design's role in mediating between humans and their environments, but had a different and more expansive conception of design. While for many of these modernist architects, biotechnic design excluded traditional arts, historical continuity, and rural life, Mairet believed that animal husbandry and agriculture were also methods of design. For her, biotechnics focused on the inherent technical potential of a material as developed by nature and culture over time and in place. Mairet's writings on wool exemplify how she thought of biotechnics of textile materials. I'm showing you here pages from a series of 42 textile portfolios that Mairet created during World War II. And this was a major archival source I had the challenge of interpreting. Through the juxtaposition of short texts, swatches, and materials and photographs, Mairet demonstrated her approach. To summarize, she believed that to understand wool, one needed to understand breeds of sheep. In studying the breeds of sheep, one was quickly led to the history of the breeds, which she showed was a history of human migrations and politics, as in the example of the merino, which was brought to Europe and Spain through China and Persia, and then gifted to England's George III, who then sent it to the colonies of Australia and New Zealand. Thus, we already begin to see that sheep are not in themselves merely natural, but are coexisting, co-evolving, and shaped by human action. The history of migration led to the subject of ecology, the relation between animals and place, the way that breeds responded to and then adapted to different climates and systems. In addition, sheep breeding was a human tradition of developing the fleece according to human needs and desires. In this way, the study of textile crossed into the subjects of history, politics, biology, economics, geography, and art. To understand wool in this way, in terms of biotechnics, meant to know its technical capabilities in both material and cultural forms, including the ways that craftsmen had responded to it. To research the connections and history behind an object is one thing, however, but for Mairet's weaving workshop apprentices, they had an additional challenge. What was the practicing weaver to do with this knowledge? What is a biotechnic aesthetic? Here, a contrast with Bauhaus weaving makes Mairet's concept clear. One leading scholar, for instance, shows how the grid was an important structure and concept for modernist art and for Bauhaus weavers, and argues for considering the warp-weft grid structure as textile's most essential property. But structure is only one factor in textiles that we could emphasize. For Mairet, expressing the biotechnics of materials meant focusing on properties of materials and yarns that were more fundamental than structure. In her own textiles, this biotechnic aesthetics is evident in her handling of yarns and structure. This red and gray scarf on the left in Mairet's archive is characteristic of her work. The gray yarns are naturally colored wool, and the red is bright and may either be dyed in Mairet's signature natural matter techniques or actually might be chemically dyed. Mairet's piece is loosely beaten and the gray yarns writhe beneath the red grid. The texture is moving in all directions of the fabric and invites touch. In contrast, the Bauhaus weaver Günther Stotzel's piece is tight, taut, and comparatively constrained. Mairet's textiles are also largely plain weave, and variety comes from the juxtaposition of textures and colors. Mairet's weaves do not emphasize a grid, but create a mesh. Her yarns are not tightly woven, ordered, and subsumed into the structure, but twist within it and allow the characteristics of the wools, rather than the weave structure, full expression. Furthermore, however, at the Bauhaus, cultural, historical, and natural historical knowledge was not considered a prerequisite for designing. Materials are often described by Bauhaus weavers in terms of timeless essences and ahistorical. Despite scattered references to the importance of redressing the alienation from materials which modern civilization imposes on the artist, None of the Bauhaus weavers speak of how so-called raw materials come into being, and none of them discuss how silkworms, cotton plants, or sheep. In contrast, Mairet showed how the material that showed up in a studio was not simply raw material, but had already been shaped by historical processes and human decisions before they were warped on a loom. In responding to the biotechnics of materials, a weaver's task was to understand these longer histories, going back to the sheep themselves, and work with the material to bring out its inherent technical capabilities suitable for different uses. So although I focus in this article on wool, Mairet also explored the inherent potential of new fibers such as rayon and plastics. But her modernism should not be measured by her use of new laboratory materials. For her, materials were a focus of reinvention, even of traditional methods, designs, and practices. And while the work of scientists and industrialists was recognized as advanced technology, she argued that the work of farmers were perhaps the most important player in the biotechnical design process, even though they often went unrecognized. For her, the research work in material development and weaving that was based on and continuing in rural workshops, and she specifically pointed to women's historic and future role in the textile trade. In these ways, biotechnics, the concept of biotechnics served her as a particularly useful concept in attempting to reformulate rather than reject the relationship between handcraft and industrial production. Mairet understood that textiles and their materials were evidence of history and the creative and technical decisions of past craft workers, and she sought to understand and use technology intelligently and toward the furthering of human development and well-being. In this sense, contemporary companies such as Smartwool and Lanico and sustainability approaches like biodesign and biomimicry build on the longer history of mediating how textile materials relate to their multiple environments: human, natural, and technological. Like Mairet, they might use their research into biomaterials to mediate between thoughtful design and mechanical production, between traditional knowledge and modern innovation. Thank you very much. I look forward to you discussing.
Okay, thank you so much, Antonia, for that wonderful presentation. It's so great to see your article come alive in the way you speak to it, but also the images that you gather. And I guess you've had a bit more time too to think on it. Now, we will wait until the end of the 3 talks before we have questions, but please feel free to pop something in the chat in terms of a flag, an issue you want to flag, or a question for us to consider, but we'll wait to see how they come together. But already I can see with Antonia's, there's a great interest in what this research does practically in terms of uncovering somebody who may have been overlooked, but has so much relevance to the kind of ideas and practices that are around today. So next I'd like to invite Vishal Khandelwal to speak to us. Vishal is a visiting assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh Department of History of Art and Architecture, specializing in modern art of South Asia. His article follows the Indian textile artist Nelly Sethna as she moves between the USA, particularly the Cranbrook Academy of Art, and her home in Bombay. And he argues for a prominent role of textile art in Michigan and Bombay. So Vishal, welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, Kevin. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully begin. So as Antonia mentioned, I'm also very grateful for this platform to present this article, and especially I'm very happy to be presenting this work alongside Antonia and Michael both, and I look forward to our feedback and questions to figure out some kind of overlaps, which I already see in the work as well. The article that was published in the Journal of Modern Craft, or the JMC, is part of an effort to understand the place of textiles within 19th and 20th century arts and architecture in a globally interconnected South Asia. And much like the other articles in this journal issue, it focuses on the career of a female artist whose work is little known within largely male-dominated histories of modernism. To provide some background, Nelly Sethna was born in 1932 in Bombay, current-day Mumbai, and attended the JJ School of Art in the city. She thereafter completed her studies at the Regent Polytechnic in London, worked as a graphic designer in Stuttgart, and then returned to Bombay in 1957 to work as chief textile designer for Bombay Dyeing, a well-known textiles manufacturing firm set up during the colonial era, and British colonial rule in the Indian subcontinent ended in 1947. Subsequently, Sethna received a scholarship to attend the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan between 1958 and 1959, where the weaving workshop was led by the Finnish-American textile designer Marian Strengel. This experience at Cranbrook, after which Sethna came back to India to work for Bombay Dyeing once again, proved the starting point for my article. Within art historical scholarship, quite a lot is known about mid-20th century South Asian painters and sculptors who traveled to the US and other parts of the world, for instance, through sponsorship by the Rockefeller Foundation. Very little has been written about industrial design in India during the 20th century or about textiles. There is some recent work, for instance, individual shows on textile artists, such as Mrinalini Mukherjee, whose work you see in the center here, and Ritin Mazumdar, whose work was shown at the Chatterjee and Lal Gallery recently in Bombay, as well as exhibitions in textiles and industrial design that have included Sethna's work, among that of other artists and designers. And while Sethna's later work from the 1970s and 80s, which you're seeing here, particularly her experiments with other collaborators and with traditional Indian textile arts, are well known via exhibitions and within scholarship. Her early works from the 1950s and 60s, not so much. I have found one surviving early work, possibly screen printed or hand painted using a roller and stencil to block out the design. And other early textiles by Sethna, mostly room dividers, wall hangings, rugs, or decorative pieces made on and off the loom both, are mostly found as representations in the mass media. My article emerged through archival research mainly in two places: New Delhi, among the influential arts critic Patwant Singh's private papers, and Cranbrook, where, with the help of a grant from the Decorative Arts Trust, I was able to consult files and documents at the Cranbrook Archive, a rich repository of mid-century art, crafts, and design pedagogy and practice. And on this slide, you see Helena Perrin-Tupa on the left, a Finnish textile designer who studied at Cranbrook around the same time and then worked in India. She also became Sethna's friend while they were studying in Cranbrook together. Sethna had mentioned her time at Cranbrook very positively to her friend Patwant Singh, the editor who I just mentioned, via personal letters. So I became interested in tracking her work's reception in the US and Indian art critical and gallery systems. To begin with, how was her work and Sethna herself received in Michigan? As a small sampling, here's an image of Sethna in a sari, teaching a children's art class in the Cranbrook community. She was also invited to give talks at other events and occasions while in Michigan. Here's an article by an author called Robert Bronner that reviews her work displayed at Gallery 4 in Detroit. And he's talking about her work in relation to another abstract artist. So it gives you a sense of the larger milieu within which her work was being displayed at that time. And in these articles, it stated that Sethna's works were selling well, that she was showcasing at venues such as the Detroit Artists Market, which was a venue that promoted both well-known figures as well as lesser-known artists. So as such, Sethna's works were making their way into homes in the Detroit area, where other textile artists and designers, such as Ruth Adler Schnee, were already running successful businesses. Within the academic context, this is a photograph of a 1959 student show at Cranbrook, and right at the bottom, jutting out towards the viewer and laid flat on a podium, are two screen printed textiles. So you're seeing them right here, most closely towards the viewer. Here is another photograph of the same two designs, once again laid horizontally, closest to the viewer again. These works look similar to the textiles published in the newspaper article on the right, and were most probably produced by Sethna, also herself included in the newspaper article. In these textiles, figural forms are represented not as naturalistic or real, but through abstract, reduced, and linear gestures. Triangles, circles, rectangles, diamonds, and straight lines make up faces and bodies, helping align these within a unified pictorial space. In other Sethna designs from the late 1950s and early 60s, some of which you see here, dark and light vertical lines intersperse each other, leaf patterns populate an uneven plane, and solid or spotted triangles and quadrilaterals lie horizontally with little spacing. No particular standard or rule for arranging figures on ground is discernible in these samples, whose designer preferred overall construction over ornamentation. In her conception, good design was plain and simple, with scope for multiple variations. She often stated that she did not just like to weave, but to design. How might one visually situate Sethna's early production and formal experimentation? For example, her Cranbrook teacher's Strangle was invested in a kind of abstract play that is attributable to her Scandinavian heritage, and also to her interest in Peruvian and oceanic visual culture, which she admitted. And these are some sketches from Strangle's papers that showcase an emphasis in geometric forms and designs. Art and design exhibitions at Cranbrook too help students acquire knowledge about global arts. This is a list of exhibitions from 1946 on Paul Klee, Joseph Albers, Mexican engravings, and so on. So one can imagine how Sethna, much like contemporaries in the textiles field or arts field at large, borrowed from abstraction, minimalism, and global folk and vernacular arts during the mid-20th century. And these works sold well within a plush market for elite consumer goods in the US after World War II. Upon returning to India, Sethna continued to work for Bombay Dyeing, and in 1966 was appointed as a consultant at the National Institute of Design, or NID, post-colonial India's first design training academy of its kind, modeled on the German Bauhaus school, but with significant incorporation of Indian crafts and a consideration of the concerns of post-colonial Indian consumers and society. At the NID, Sethna helped set up looms in the weaving workshop and started instructing students, tasks that were taken up by other faculty, including her friend from Cranbrook, Perhentupa, even though Sethna continued to serve as an external supervisor of student final projects at the design school. In India, Sethna's works were hung in domestic environments and in gallery spaces. The Jehangir Art Gallery, established in 1952, was one of the various venues in Bombay that consistently displayed her work. These are examples from a bit later in the 1970s, but give you a sense of her work as it was displayed in both homes and galleries. There's one reviewer from the Times of India commenting on a 1960 Jehangir Art Gallery show. This writer classifies Sethna's work as applied arts, praising their simplicity, lack of ornamentation, and attention to texture and structure that collectively, quote, put to shame some of the ephemeral efforts of the haughty practitioners of the fine arts, end quote. The writer also attributes the work's supposedly masculinist boldness and forcefulness to Sethna's Western training. Other writers, such as Veronica Hogg and Romesh Malhotra, who were writing in India at the time, too thought of Sethna's Western training as very important for producing good work. even though Sethna herself did not distinguish her textiles in this way by means of distinct identitarian or national origin sort of categories. In my article, an attentiveness to how Sethna's works are received and talked about within the professional and popular media gives us a sense of what terms or concepts such as identity or simplicity or functionality became attached to their analysis and evaluation across cultural contexts in both the US and India. This gives us a sense of how the textile arts gained ascendancy across parallel art systems and at around the same time. Sethna's collaborations with architects such as Joseph Allen Stein, also Cranbrook educated and based in India since the early 1950s, provide avenues for further research. In this regard, my work turns next to understanding how Sethna and other contemporary textile artists worked with architects and designers in ways that transform the nature of their practices within a socioeconomic context removed from the booming US economy after World War II, but that still supported a vibrant consumer culture, as well as gallery and critical system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vishal, for that remarkable talk and remarkable life that you've focused on. Hard to think of anyone who shares a similar kind of trajectory as Nelly Sethna between the US and India like that, and raises a lot of very interesting comparisons with Antonia's work. So thank you so much. And next we go to Michael Mamp. Michael is now at Louisiana State University, where he researches the contributions of women and the LGBTQI community in US fashion. His article is about the larger-than-life Ethel Wallace, who brought batik into modern fashion in a context of Javanese Orientalism centered in Greenwich Village. So, Michael, look forward to hearing about Ethel Wallace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I am going to get my screen up. Well, like my esteemed colleagues, I'm so grateful and honored to be here and to have this opportunity to discuss the work of Ethel Wallace with all of you. Ethel has been a part of my life now for a very long time, and the narrative continues to reveal itself to me as I have opportunities like this to discuss her work and her history with others. The image, just as a note, that you see in the background of my slides today is actually taken from a small surviving sample of one of Wallace's batiks. So Ethel Wallace was born in Recklesstown, New Jersey in 1886. And in the early part of the 20th century, she relocated from Recklesstown, which is now Morristown, New Jersey, to Lambertville, New Jersey. Lambertville is situated on the Delaware River directly across from New Hope, Pennsylvania, which continues to be an artist's enclave today. The images that you see here on this screen are of Wallace from the early 1920s. My research and this subsequent article focuses on Wallace's batik work. In the early part of the 20th century, batik, primarily batik influenced by practices of Java, although there are batik practices from all over the world. I think that due to colonialism and the Dutch wanting to find a way to export components of saleable items, craft from their colonies, the batik of Java really became part of this Java mania that existed in the early part of the 20th century. So my research looks at Wallace's batik work, primarily done in the 1920s, and is situated within concepts of modernism, cultural appropriation, and this overarching trend in the decorative arts of the period as it relates to cultural appropriation and batik across a variety of venues. Wallace is shown here in front of a batik of her own design, and then in profile in this photograph, again, both of which are from about 1920. The primary source material that I utilized for this research came from the estate of Christina Barbara Johnson, who I'm eternally grateful to, and to her daughter, Janiyah Cookie Johnson, who I think might even be here with us today. It's a really great story that I could go into, but just briefly, I was working for a very long time to try to write Wallace's history. It was originally what I intended to do for my dissertation, and that's over a decade ago now. But I found that I wasn't able to get everything that I needed. And after Christina Barbara Johnson passed away, her daughter, Cookie, found my letters and my voicemail messages where I was trying to connect with her to gain access to Wallace's papers and archives. So I'll be forever grateful that Cookie decided to get in touch with me, and that made this research possible. Wallace, when her family lived in Lambertville, New Jersey, became an apprentice working for William Lathrop, who many recognize as the father of Pennsylvania Impressionism. Lathrop had relocated to the New Hope, Pennsylvania area and started an artist's workshop in Colony that exists to this day at Phillips Mill, referred to as the Phillips Mill Association. And a particular type of impressionistic painting came out of the artists that were working with Lathrop at this time. A very distinctive landscape painting style with very soft color, warm tone. And what you see on the screen is an example of Wallace's early work as a painter. She was a classically trained artist, both as an apprentice for William Lathrop, producing work very similar to his, such as you see here, this piece from approximately 1910. But she also enrolled and took classes at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art over a period of approximately 12 years, where she studied drawing and cast making. So this personifies Wallace's early work, and I provide this just as context to understand where she began and where she ultimately then ended up in terms of modernism and batik. In the late 19-teens, Wallace relocated to New York City and established a studio in Greenwich Village. And she quickly, being a very outgoing personality, developed a circle of influential friends. But there were two that made a particular impact on her approach to art making. And one of them was Joseph Stella. Wallace was enamored with Stella's geometric abstract interpretations of New York City architecture, particularly his interpretations of the Brooklyn Bridge. And in about 1920, she painted this portrait of Stella that you see here, which was a really big departure from the work that she had been doing previously under the influence of William Lathrop. So this is really the earliest known example of Wallace attempting to approach composition from a modernist form, abstracting the shape, the form, flattening the surface, using color in more bold and interesting ways. And Stella himself had really struggled to find a voice until he found modernism and abstraction. He also had a very classically, some people don't realize that Stella came from a very classic tradition in terms of his approach to art making. So Wallace always credited Stella with pushing her to explore new ways of expressing herself creatively. Around that time is when she began to experiment with her first pieces that she made that weren't paintings. One of the earliest examples being this 4-panel screen that she made, cut, made, painted herself, and was exhibited in the Belle Maison Gallery and Wanamaker department store, which focused on decorative arts. There were 7 artists, makers included in that exhibition. Wallace was the only woman to be included in that exhibition. And this particular screen, which depicts this medieval scene, survives to this day, and it is owned by Jim Altman, who owns a gallery in Lambertville, Jim's of Lambertville. So this is the only example that I'm aware of that where Wallace made a piece of furniture. And then shortly thereafter, she made the acquaintance of Eva Gautier. Eva Gautier, who is credited by many as being the songstress that introduced America to Javanese folk music. In my own research, what I uncovered is that Eva Gautier, really through cultural appropriation, often billed herself as the only white woman to have studied Java culture as closely as she did. She was sort of a, sorry to say, second-rate opera singer who then incorporated traditional, what she said were traditional Javanese folk songs into her repertoire. And because this was all happening in the 20s with this fascination with batik and all things sort of Oriental, and I'm using the quotes there in a very broad way, she became very popular as it was seen as exotic and something unique and different. She would perform, she was a singer, she incorporated these songs that she said were authentic, when in fact she had taken original songs and had them rearranged to suit Western preferences. And she also wore garments like the ones that you see her here that featured batik. And she would give little talks during her performances as well about Java culture and particularly the practice of batik. So Wallace made Eva Gautier's acquaintance and was really inspired by her presentation of batik and began a process of figuring out how to incorporate batik into her own craft practice. At the same time, in the early 1920s, Wallace was also influenced by the king of fashion himself, Paul Poiret, who had adopted a really new form of dressing, is often credited with releasing women during this time period from their corsets, but did so with a romanticized, very fantasy-based idea of the Orient, using Orientalism in really broad strokes, influencing his work, taking broad geographic regions and distilling it down. He also claimed that his looks were authentic, but in fact, they were based in a fantasy, probably inspired by the Ballet Russe more so than anything authentic. But this style of fashion was really at the forefront in the early 1920s and inspired how Wallace would think about interpreting the fabrics that she made into fashion. So the departure point for me in this research was actually this portrait of Paul Poiret that my husband purchased many years ago. And I remember I walked into the room and said, "What's Paul Poiret doing on our wall? And where did you find him?" My husband had purchased this from a dealer in Lambertville, New Jersey. And I immediately, being a fashion historian, recognized Poiret. But this was a portrait that Wallace painted of him when he visited New York in 1922. So there is evidence that she met him, that she had somewhat of a relationship with him, and she was certainly enamored with him based upon this surviving portrait, which I'm happy to say is in our collection. This is an example of the type of fashion work that Wallace did, and all of the clothing that she made, all of the garments that she designed were put together from textiles that she designed and made herself as well, all from this batik method. One of her early supporters was Gertrude Payne Whitney, shown here in a batik gown and medieval-inspired headdress that Wallace completed in approximately 1922. Wallace was also an early exhibitor in the precursor to the Whitney Museum, which was Gertrude Payne Whitney's studio, where she often featured the work of up-and-coming artists or people that she found to be interesting. These are several other examples of the type of fashion that Wallace did, and you can see this very similar connection to the work of Poiret. Long flowing robes like the one that you see on the left. Things were often referred to as, Chinese boudoir jacket and satin pants, and using terms, obviously, that we now can recognize as being related to Orientalism. but really perpetuating this idea of the exotic. This look in the center, which was featured in a book from 1921 called First Lessons in Batik by Gertrude Lawrence, was comprised of velvet batik that Wallace had made, and then the trim around the neck is monkey fur, as is the trim on the seam of the sleeve. So Wallace made a massive amount of fabric that she used for creating these fashions for clients like Gertrude Payne Whitney, and also her fashions were sold at leading luxury retailers of the time, such as Bonwit Teller. There are just a few surviving examples of the fashion work that Wallace completed during this period. Here is one that's being held up by Dara Miller. She's the daughter of famed, also Bucks County painter Rad Miller. This is a sort of opera coat that Wallace made from also the 1920s, shown here, with the pattern achieved through a process of batik. She also made yardage that was sold to other designers during the time. One example is this composition called Chaucer's Garden. This is a batik on silk that was reproduced and sold through a purveyor. So Wallace was making yardage for herself that she made into garments for individual clients and also then sold at stores. And then she was also creating yardage that was utilized by other designers in the period. All of this focus on batik making really centered in Greenwich Village. And she joined a group of women makers like Amy Molly Hicks and Marguerite Zorak and Martha Riker, who all were working in batik. It's interesting in that batik provided an avenue for women to experiment with modernism, particularly during this time. And again, that enthusiasm was really centered initially in Greenwich Village, where Wallace's studio was located. Quickly thereafter, she moved into making wall hangings or compositions that were then framed. This is an example of one of these hangings that Wallace created, which tells the familiar Bible story of Salome and John the Baptist. What is so interesting about this portrayal is that Wallace has reinterpreted this from a feminist perspective, presenting Salome in the stance of the Shiva Nataraju, who is both the creator and destroyer of all things, really taking Salome and looking at Salome from a different perspective. Typically, when we think of images, and there have been so many of Salome over the centuries, the head, the severed head, is really kind of front and center in the composition. It's so hard to see here because it's quite small, but the head is actually to the right. So she's rethought and represented this idea of Salome in this very interesting composition. She then gained probably her biggest notoriety for completing what she called batik portraits, or what sometimes was referred to in the press as batik painting. She did portraits of Ava Gautier, depicted here on the left. This one survives in the estate of Christina Barber Johnson, and then also Mary Hoyt Wyborg. Wallace's work was exhibited widely across the United States and abroad. And I was fortunate to have a very rich amount of press clippings and gallery exhibition catalogs to utilize as source material from Wallace's archive. So I hope that the work that I've done with Wallace helps to yet add to the canon another story of a forgotten woman. This final image is a small piece that's remaining that was in the collection of the Michener Museum of Art in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. Hopefully in the next year or so, we're in the preliminary stages of putting together an exhibition. What I've shown you today are primarily Wallace's textiles, but there's a large number of surviving paintings of her work as well. So we're working, Janaya and myself, in tandem with the Michener to hopefully put together an exhibition that will be available to the public in the next year or so. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Michael, for that remarkable life that you've shared with us. And it's interesting to hear of all the other people that you've engaged with at the same time who have been related or have collected the work. So it's interesting, even if these figures are forgotten, there's still something in the social networks of collecting that retains that sort of memory, which is very interesting. So we have a little time now for discussion and questions. Clearly, Antonia, Vishal, and Michael, you're welcome to ask questions or comments about each other's work. There may be others here with us who have questions or comments as well that they would like to share. So please feel free to come forward with that. But while we're thinking about that, I liked your comment at the end, Michael, about the forgotten women. And it raises an interesting issue about the kind of research that you three have done, the degree to which it has a bearing on what the current scene is. Since you've been doing your research and published the work, have you found that there have been particular influences of the women that you've been studying amongst contemporary makers, designers, artists? Have you found any sort of contemporary parallels? Because a lot of what they're doing does seem to be very relevant to the kind of work being done today. Michael, Antonia, Vishal, do you have any comments about that? Vishal.
Yeah, no, I can answer that in I guess two ways. One would be there's been a lot of interest in people like Sethna, Mrinalini Mukherjee, Ritin Muzumdar, their works, and in the kind of gallery system recently that I'm seeing in India and beyond. And I think that has to do with a greater kind of understanding of these works as fitting within a broadly conceived definition of art. And I'm also noting that contemporary art practices are kind of adopting textile and fiber forms quite centrally. And it's interesting because I don't necessarily, in the case of the history of fiber art in South Asia and India, I don't necessarily see it as a kind of feminized medium in the way, say, Eliza Arthur or Julia Brand Wilson talk about it being very kind of important to, say, the development of fiber art and crafts in the US. So even though you had various kinds of women and male practitioners, the history of textile production in South Asia is not necessarily a kind of it's not a medium that is coded as feminine. Male as well as female practitioners would weave textiles or would spin yarn, right? So it's not got the same kind of feminist lineage or a kind of feminine lineage, I should say. But then I guess the representation and restoration of figures like Sethna becomes a kind of very sort of feminist exercise within the history of the fiber movement. So that's one way in which I would see the kind of broader interest in people like Sethna today.
Michael?
Yes, I think one thing I would add to that, Kevin, is just that as I have had the opportunity to see the work of people like Bisa Butler, I'm not sure if people are familiar with her quilts, but there was an amazing exhibit in Chicago, I think last year. And Bisa Butler is utilizing textiles, quilt making as a way to explore African-American Black identity. And so I think that there is a continually emerging trend for particularly women makers and artists and designers to embrace fiber as a means of expression. But I think that the stories are probably more authentic. While I think there's value in obviously documenting and adding Wallace's history to our collective knowledge, Wallace was telling a story that was in some ways appropriated, whereas I see the work of Bisa Butler as being more authentic. So I think that the current makers are thinking more critically and self-reflective around how to interpret and respond to their lives from a perspective of positionality that Wallace didn't really do.
Mm. Before we go to Kamya, I see you've got your hand up. I wonder, Antonia, Mairet seems so contemporary in the way in which she looks at the dialogue between the human and the more than human, if you were to account sheep as that category. Do you find interest amongst the broad variety of artists and makers?
Yeah, I mean, with Mairet specifically, not yet, but I hope that people will be interested in her work. I think a lot of what I tried to do in researching and interpreting her work is think about, those connections of the kinds of issues in terms of sustainability and the connections between, human ecology and the natural worlds that a lot of contemporary makers are engaged in. And I think it does sort of point, as I said, to this sort of earlier history of things that we're concerned with now. I think in the broader sense, there is a lot of contemporary interest in the intersection between textiles and crafts and technology and things like computing. Thinking about, craft and making, the history of computers and the computing sort of intersection with the history of textiles. And a lot of makers are really interested in these earlier histories, not only as sort of ways to go back and claim, again, sort of a feminist place for computer science or something like this, but also to think through, well, what are the connections between textiles and technology? How can we then think about this issue again and really take this forward? And I find this most interesting in the intersection between craft makers, craft making, and people who are also simultaneously working in things like materials engineering. And I think that that's a really, really interesting space for contemporary makers in trying to actually create materials in a new way.
Thanks. I can imagine a lot of makers being quite surprised that ideas which seem so new had such a lineage that you've revealed. Kamya, what do you have to say?
Thank you so much, Vishal, Antonia, and Michael for today's presentations. They were great. Absolutely enjoyed them. I had sort of question, comment, collocations. Antonia, I really loved the way you structured your presentation because the sort of segue from Smartwool into Ethel Mairet's life, I think, yeah, it's really interesting and useful to find these connections. I also found myself thinking of Uniqlo, the other brand that sort of has this extremely technical approach to textiles. But I was wondering if you had anything specific to say in terms of the relevance Ethel has for craft education today. And I think this is a question that Aarti might also find very interesting. I was just thinking. And I mean, I had also a remark for Vishal, but should I let Antonia go first?
Yes, stay on the line, Kamya.
Sure, I can respond to that. What a wonderful question. And I'm so glad that it resonated. I think that one thing that I explore in greater depth in the article itself is Mairet's theory of education. And she really thought that textiles were an ideal sort of portal into thinking about all of the topics of the rest of the world. Just by looking at a single thing, we can sort of think about ecology, we can think about biology, not just in terms of the plant and ecology and things like this, but also the chemistry of dyes and how dyeing is made, and chemistry, geography, mathematics in how weaving is counted. She really thought it was kind of this ideal portal out into general education. So she developed this technique for primary schools, for adult education courses, for a variety of different kinds of audiences who were not necessarily then going to go on and become weavers themselves, but could, through textiles, kind of have this broader view onto the world and use them as a method of connecting to larger histories. And I think that, in some ways, this sort of reminds me of what a lot of scholarship and a lot of what makers themselves talk about today in terms of using the object as sort of a method and a portal for these larger histories. So I really see a really nice resonance between that there.
Good. And Kamya, did you have something for Vishal?
Yeah, Vishal, thanks so much for your presentation. I loved it. I just wanted to say that it got me thinking about the British artist Grayson Perry and how his choice of tapestries, textiles, it's a sort of deliberate political choice almost, the way he articulates it. He says, you know, textile arts are always seen as somehow second or inferior to, well, other forms of art like painting. So I was thinking of his tapestries, but I was wondering if you had come across anything in South Asian narratives that suggests that the textile arts were somehow secondary in a hierarchy of the arts, or is this entirely a Western inheritance?
Yeah, I think, thanks for that question. I think closely related to that is the distinction between fine and applied arts. So textiles under the kind of British colonial system of art schools established in the mid-19th century would fall squarely within applied arts, which within the colonial system would kind of occupy a lower rung than fine art, like painting and sculpture. And that hierarchy wasn't necessarily kind of present in pre-colonial times, say, among the arts. So I think you're absolutely right. It's a kind of colonial setup. And then in the post-colonial period, as well as in the colonial period, there are various artists, practitioners who are trying to kind of fight against that imposition. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Arti, you've got a question there. Are you able to, or a comment, are you able to say it? I know Arti was sort of coming in and out of this session, so we'll hold it there. I wonder, Michael, if you could do you have anything to say about, sorry, Arti, while you're there?
Sorry, I'm in the middle of work, but I can't help. Also, I'm listening to you on this mobile. So anyway, thank you very much, Michael, Antonia, and Vishal. Thank you for the Reinventing the Wheel. This kind of platform makes me think how the emergence of women artists has some, I mean, what is the funding trajectory? I mean, Vishal mentioned that Nelly was a Rockefeller artist. And I'm curious to know, what is the trajectory of capital that was following the emergence of these three women artists in America? And of course, in India, it was, you said, Rockefeller artists. So it would be interesting to hear from all three of you about this. Yeah, thank you.
Michael?
I'm thinking.
You went to unmute, so it's
Oh,
fun.
sorry, can you hear me?
We can, yes, yes.
Okay.
So you think aloud for us.
I was just thinking, sorry.
Can I tag on to this a little bit? This
Please.
question while you're all thinking, because I was looking at this also similarly, and particularly with Ethel Wallace. And while appropriation, of course, is an issue, she was really kind of an entrepreneur. And I was just I'm wondering how much of her art, how much of what she did was motivated by needing to make money to continue as an artist, because I don't remember any information about funding for her.
Yeah, thank you for getting me going, Cookie. Yes, it is interesting, and it was one of the challenges in this research. You know, one, fiber has this nature where it just doesn't last a long time unless it's cared for. But part of the reason why there wasn't that much surviving of her textiles is because it was made and sold and used. And so at one point it was reported that she had produced over 2,500 yards of fabric that she then subsequently sold. So yes, I think she was motivated to make money through the creation and sale of her batiks in order to then continue to pursue what she saw as the more artistic form, which was the batik portraitures. And in that vein, the portraitures gave her sort of recognition and the ability to exhibit things in a museum or gallery setting. But it was the creation and sale of fabric that kept her going financially. And she didn't have any funding that I'm aware of other than what she, very scrappily did and made and sold for herself.
I mean, I know she died destitute. So there's that. It's very much of a shame, but.
Vishal?
And Antonia, did you want to go ahead first?
Sure. No, this is a really interesting and very important question. I did actually think quite a lot about, I think in all three of our talks, we were dealing with a certain interesting issue of what is still available in terms of the actual textile works themselves and how much was produced and then actually consumed, really. In the case of Ethel, I mean, she was also an entrepreneur. She ran a very successful shop called The Gospels. She had a shop in Brighton. She had some hand weaving galleries and sort of craft workshop galleries in London, different ones at different times. And she was quite successful, which is interesting. And during the Second World War, a lot of these small workshops closed and hers remained open and remained successful. Everything that passed through there, we don't have. She sold a lot of things. She didn't put tags in her items. We don't have most of what she produced. Now, that being said, and she was able to sustain her own livelihood through that, as well as operating a bit of an apprenticeship and schooling system through her workshop. That said, her startup capital came from her first husband, Ananda Kumaraswamy, who was a quite famous Indian art historian, and their lands, I believe, in Ceylon. But at a certain point in time, she was able to, write to him and say, I don't need this anymore. I'm fine. I'm on my own. She had an interesting sort of take on the place of the small workshop within the larger textile business sort of ecosystem, and was often very concerned. So she was doing well herself, but she was often very concerned about the ability of these smaller workshops doing sort of interesting experimental bespoke work to be able to survive in a very highly competitive textile marketplace, against firms like Courtaulds and sort of the big business of textiles. And I imagine that, similar issues of the economic landscape might also have been in play in India as well.
In the case of Nelly, so Mehta, before she gets married to Homi Sethna and becomes Nelly Sethna, she wasn't necessarily born into a very rich family. So she's not coming from, say, great financial means. She ends up in the US on a scholarship. So it's a scholarship called the Ellen Scripps Booth Memorial Fellowship that's awarded by Cranbrook. So Marianne Strengle, the Finnish designer who's working at Cranbrook, when she visits India on a trip, she notes Nelly's work and then she invites her to apply for the scholarship. Nelly gets the scholarship, and that kind of pays for her time in the US. Even in her time, during her time in England, when she was there for a year, I don't remember how she got there. I think, if I'm not wrong, I might have to verify this, her family was able to pay for her passage, but I do know that while she was there, she was kind of making textile works for commercial sale and kind of was working part-time while studying to pay for her everyday kind of expenditure. In the US, she was making money through the sale of her works in the local art exhibitions and galleries. So in letters to Patwan Singh, her friend in Delhi, she constantly says things like, I want to travel to, say, Japan on my way back to India from the US, but I'm running out of money. Or Patwan's like, could you pick up some Noguchi lamps for me on your way back? And Nelly's like, I don't really have the money to do that because everything that I have is being paid for the trip. So it's clear that she's not necessarily of means at all during this time. But when she gets married, and she says this herself in interviews, that's when she really comes into money, because her husband comes from a very wealthy family. So in the kind of 70s and 80s, she's much better off when she's working. And but along the way, she wins other fellowships. So in 1972, she wins a Homi Bhabha Fellowship, named after the nuclear scientist, and that allows her to travel in India to do work with traditional textiles called kalamkari textiles. So different kinds of funding sources finance her work, and she comes into sort of a wealthy milieu later on in life.
Vishal, was she? You said, but how was she noticed? Was she, because is it when she was at the JJ School of Art?
This was she was noted when I want to say it was after her time at JJ, but I when she was about 25 years old, that's when Marianne Stengel was visiting Bombay and saw her. So I think, if I'm not wrong, I might have to verify this again, but I think it was after JJ, because she sort of ended her studies, she truncated her studies, goes to London, comes back, works for Bombay Dyeing for a year, and then during that year, I think she gets noticed. So after London, finishing her diploma, comes back, gets noticed, and then goes to the US. So it's in between. So right after her London studies, her JJ studies are truncated. She doesn't complete them, but she does complete her London diploma. And actually, she this might have kind of been a confusion, but she's not kind of in the US on a Rockefeller fellowship. Those fellowships were awarded to other, say, artists and sculptors. I just placed that as a kind of comparison of money that is framing conversations between these two art worlds, including the Rockefeller money. But she's not a recipient of a Rockefeller Foundation grant.
Oh, okay, that's what confused me, but it was a good trigger, because it's interesting to see that the circulation between, and Antonia, you mentioned that Mary was the wife of Ananda Kumaraswamy. That's quite amazing to know, and he ends up in Boston. Yeah, so I think these kind of, and also all three are in some ways also the almost embryonic to the global art industry, textile art industry, studio textile arts, and global fashion in the sense. So to me, it sounds very exciting, because at some level, all three, and you can see the trajectory from South Asia to the continent and then to America. But I think that's very interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you for making that connection, Arti. Yes, very important. I can't help, our time has run out, but I want to quickly ask Michael whether there has been any interest or response to the work in Indonesia, where, or in Asia generally, where batik is practiced with Ethel's work.
Has there been, what was that again, Kevin? I had
any response or interest from Indonesians or other Asian countries where batik is practiced?
No, but I think that it's another venue or vein for us to explore and think about. It's just fraught with so much complicated history around batik and its export as a commodity. But I think that's an interesting idea.
Well, speaking from Australia, where there's been a terrific creative dialogue between batik artisans and Aboriginal painters, there has been a lot of generosity in sharing that culture and technique, perhaps for a future paper. Well, thank you so much, Antonia, Vishal, and Michael. I think not just for presenting this morning, your time, but also for the work you've done in documenting these pioneers of textile art in the 20th century, each in their own way, offering something quite unique in terms of its possibility and development, not just originality, but also a recovery of very important traditions and cultures that are part of the global scene. And thank you for publishing it in Journal of Modern Craft, so that there is this peer-reviewed academic archive of that research, but also particularly for sharing it with us live in person today, so that it can be enjoyed by a wide audience who will be able to reflect on your words. So go well, and thank you, and please feel free to join us in the next spoke of the wheel.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.